The hacienda sat on a hill overlooking the cane fields, its white walls gleaming in the afternoon sun like teeth. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and tobacco, rosewater and leather. The masters called it prosperity. The enslaved called it nothing at all. To name a place is to own it, and they owned nothing, not even the sweat on their backs. Leah arrived when she was 8, small-boned and quick-fingered, sold from a coastal estate after her mother died of fever. Don Cristobal's wife, Doña Isabela, took one look at the child and declared her charming, the way one might admire a songbird. They dressed her in miniature finery, taught her to curtsy and recite scripture, paraded her before guests as proof of their Christian mercy. She poured wine at dinner parties. She sang hymns in the chapel. She slept on a cushion in the hallway outside the mistress's bedroom like a dog. The others in the quarters watched her with pity and contempt. She ate better than they did. She wore shoes. But she was never free, not for a moment. Every gesture was observed, corrected, punished with a slap or a night locked in the root cellar. She learned to smile with her mouth and hide everything else behind her eyes. By the time Leah turned 17, she had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through the hacienda like smoke, refilling glasses before they emptied, lighting candles before dusk fell, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Don Cristobal's guests marveled at her. Like a little shadow, they said. They never imagined what shadows remember. The night everything changed, a guest arrived from the capital, a merchant named Salazar with gold rings on every finger. He drank too much and spoke too freely, boasting of his plantations, his profits, his power over life and death. When Leah brought him brandy, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her onto his lap, laughing as she struggled. Don Cristobal watched from across the table and said nothing. Doña Isabela smiled behind her fan. That silence, that permission, was the spark. Leah did not scream. She did not weep. She waited until Salazar released her, then curtsied and returned to the kitchen, her face blank as wax. But something had cracked open inside her, and through that crack came a single burning thought. They would let me die for their amusement. The hacienda had always been a tomb. Now it would become a pyre. Chapter 1. The Shadow Learns to See. They said she was too small to lift a knife, until the bells stopped ringing. Leah had been 12 when she first understood the architecture of power. It happened in the chapel, where Doña Isabela dragged her after she'd spilled wine on a guest's sleeve. The mistress made her kneel on raw rice for 2 hours while reciting the rosary, her knees bleeding through her dress. Afterward, Leah limped back to the kitchen and saw Rosa, the head cook, watching her with eyes like flint. "You think you're special because they dress you up?" Rosa said, her voice low. "You're meat, same as the rest of us." Leah said nothing. She never did. But Rosa was wrong about one thing. Leah wasn't meat. She was a tool. And tools learn the weight of the hands that wield them. 5 years later, the night Salazar grabbed her, Leah carried the memory of that humiliation like a stone in her chest. She moved through the hacienda in her usual silence, lighting the evening candles, banking the kitchen fire, folding linens. Don Cristobal and his guests drank until midnight, their laughter echoing off the tile floors. Salazar stayed 3 days. Each night he found a reason to touch her, a hand on her shoulder, fingers tracing her jaw, breath reeking of tobacco and brandy. The masters did not intervene. They found it amusing. On the 3rd night after the guests retired, Leah stood in the darkened kitchen and stared at the row of copper pots hanging above the stove. Her reflection wavered in the metal, distorted and small. She thought of her mother, dead of fever because no doctor would treat a slave. She thought of Rosa's words. She thought of the root cellar, the locked door, the hymns she'd been forced to sing while her knees bled. Then she thought of fire. The hacienda was built of wood and plaster, with heavy drapes and oiled furniture. The roof was old tile, the beams dry as bone. Candles burned in every room. Oil lamps lined the corridors. The kitchen fire never went fully cold. Leah knew every room, every passage, every place where air moved and shadows gathered. She knew which floorboards creaked and which doors locked from the outside. She knew where Don Cristobal kept his keys, where Doña Isabella hid her laudanum, where the stablemaster stored lamp oil. She knew how to be invisible. That night, she did not sleep. She lay on her cushion outside the mistress's bedroom and listened to the house settle, the creak of beams, the rustle of rats in the walls, the distant barking of dogs in the slave quarters. Somewhere in the cane fields, a night bird called. Leah closed her eyes and began to count. First, she would need help. Rosa was too visible, too angry. She'd been whipped twice for insolence and watched constantly. But there was Samuel, the stable boy, who could move freely at night, and Maria, who cleaned the guest rooms and had access to linens soaked in lamp oil. Second, she would need time. The dry season was 3 weeks away. The wind came from the east at night, pushing toward the cane fields. If the hacienda burned, the fire would spread. Third, she would need proof. Not for herself. She knew what they were. But for the others, the ones who would ask why, who would call her mad or evil, she would need something undeniable. Leah opened her eyes. Through the window, she could see the stars above the cane fields, cold and distant. She wondered if her mother could see them from wherever the dead go. Then she rose, smoothed her dress, and walked to the kitchen to begin the morning's work. Her hands were steady. Her face showed nothing, but inside she had already lit the match. Chapter 2. The house holds its breath. The hacienda had rules. Slaves rose before dawn. They worked until dusk. They spoke only when spoken to, moved only when commanded, existed only to serve. Leah had lived within those rules for 9 years, her life measured in curtains opened, meals served, candles lit. Now she began to notice the spaces between the rules, the moments when no one was watching. It started small. A stub of candle pocketed while cleaning the chapel. A bottle of lamp oil moved from the storage room to the garden shed. A length of cotton wick stolen from Doña Isabella's sewing basket, thread by thread over the course of a week. Each theft was invisible, explainable. Each item could be anywhere. Maria was the first ally. She was 40, her hands gnarled from years of scrubbing floors, her back scarred from a whipping she'd received for breaking a vase. She cleaned the guest rooms, changed the linens, emptied the chamber pots. No one looked at her twice. Leah found her alone in the laundry yard one morning, beating sheets against the washing stone. The sun was barely up, the air still cool. "Do you remember the night Salazar stayed?" Leah asked, her voice low. Maria's hand stilled. She did not look up. "I remember." "Do you remember what Don Cristobal said when I screamed?" "He laughed." Leah nodded. "I need someone who can carry things, small things, from one place to another." Maria's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and assessing. "Things that burn?" "Things that burn." For a long moment, the only sound was the slap of wet cloth against stone. Then Maria said, "When?" "3 weeks, when the wind comes." Maria returned to her work, her face blank. But the next morning, Leah found a bundle of oil-soaked rags hidden in the garden shed, wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. No note, no acknowledgement. Samuel was harder. He was 14, strong and silent, assigned to the stables and the fields. He slept in the quarters with the other men, which made him dangerous. Too many ears, too many eyes. But he had keys to the storage barns, and he could move at night without suspicion if he carried a lantern and claimed to be checking the horses. Leah waited until she found him alone, mucking stalls in the afternoon heat. She brought him water in a clay cup, as she sometimes did. He drank without looking at her. "I need flint and steel," she said. Samuel's hand tightened on the cup. "What for?" "Insurance." He set the cup down carefully. "They'll kill you. They're killing me now, just slower." Samuel stared at the dirt floor, his jaw working. Finally, he said, "There's a tinderbox in the forge. I can bring it to the shed after dark." Leah nodded and walked away. 3 nights later, the tinderbox appeared beside the oil-soaked rags. The hacienda began to feel different after that. Charged, like the air before a storm. Leah moved through her daily tasks with the same mechanical precision, but now every gesture had weight. She studied the flow of servants, the rhythms of the household, the places where fire could take root and spread. The drapes in Don Cristobal's study were heavy velvet, decades old. The pantry was stocked with grain and flour, tinder in a closed space. The roof beams in the guest wing were exposed, varnished, dry. She noticed Doña Isabella's laudanum bottle was nearly empty. The mistress took it every night to sleep, 2 spoonfuls dissolved in wine. On mornings after, she woke late, groggy and irritable. Leah began adding a 3rd spoonful, just a little more. Not enough to kill, enough to ensure deep sleep. 2 weeks before the dry season, Don Cristobal hosted another dinner. Leah served in silence, refilling glasses, clearing plates. The guests talked of politics, of profits, of the new laws restricting the slave trade. One man lamented that prices were rising. Another joked that he'd have to breed his own stock. They laughed. Leah stood in the corner holding a wine decanter, her face smooth as marble. Inside she was counting. 14 guests, 4 bedrooms in the guest wing, 3 exits from the main house, 2 stable boys who could raise the alarm. When the dinner ended and the guests retired, Leah returned to the kitchen. Rosa was banking the fire, her movements slow with exhaustion. "You've been quiet," Rosa said without looking up. "I'm always quiet. Quieter than usual." Leah said nothing. She began washing the wine glasses, one by one, her hands moving in cold water. Rosa straightened, one hand pressed to her lower back. "Whatever you're planning, girl, don't get caught halfway through." "I won't." "Good, because if you burn, I don't want to burn with you." Leah set down a glass and met Rosa's eyes. "You won't." Rosa held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded and left. Leah finished the dishes. Outside, the wind was starting to shift. Chapter 3. The Ledger of Sins. The dry season arrived like a held breath. The cane fields turned brittle. The earth cracked. At night, the wind carried the smell of dust and old wood, and the hacienda creaked like a ship at sea. Leah had one final piece to gather. Proof. Don Cristobal kept his ledgers in the study, locked in a mahogany desk. She'd seen him write in them countless times, records of purchases, sales, debts. She'd never been allowed to touch them, but she'd watched him unlock the desk often enough to know which key he used, the small brass one on the ring he carried in his vest pocket. Getting the key meant waiting for the right moment. It came on a Sunday, after Mass, when Don Cristobal and the guests rode out to inspect the cane fields. Doña Isabella took her afternoon laudanum and retired to her bedroom. The house fell into drowsy quiet. Leah moved through the corridors like water, soundless and inevitable. She entered the study, closed the door behind her, and stood in the filtered sunlight. The desk waited, dark and heavy. The key was in Don Cristobal's spare vest, hanging in his bedroom. Leah retrieved it, her heart steady as a drum. Back in the study, she unlocked the desk and opened the top drawer. The ledgers were there, 3 of them bound in leather, the pages yellowed with age. She opened the first and began to read. The entries were clinical: names, ages, prices paid, causes of death, fever, exhaustion, childbirth, insolence corrected. There were notes about breeding, about which women produced strong children, about punishments administered. Her mother's name was there, recorded in neat script: purchased 1808, died of fever 1815, daughter retained for household service. Leah's hands did not shake. She'd expected this. What she hadn't expected was the volume, pages and pages of lives reduced to numbers, of suffering catalogued like inventory. She found what she needed in the second ledger. A separate section, written in Don Cristobal's hand, labeled Private Arrangements, loans made to other landowners, bribes paid to officials, payments to overseers for discretion after fatal beatings. A note about Salazar, generous terms extended, overlooked complaints, profitable connection. Leah closed the ledger. This was the proof. Not for the law, which would never care, but for herself. To know that her rage had a foundation, that this wasn't madness or sin but mathematics, a balancing of accounts. She returned the ledgers to the drawer, locked it, replaced the key. On her way out of the study, she paused by the velvet drapes. She ran her fingers along the heavy fabric, feeling how dry it was, how it would catch flame and hold it. That night she met Samuel in the garden shed. He'd brought the final supplies, a small tin of black powder he'd taken from the forge meant for blasting rocks in the fields. "This is real then," he said, his voice tight. "It's real." "When?" 3 days, when the wind is strongest." Samuel nodded. His hands were shaking. "What happens after?" Leah looked at him, young, terrified, brave. "You run. You and Maria both. Head for the river. Find the settlement near the old mission. Tell them you escaped in the chaos. And you? I'll make sure the fire starts." Samuel's throat worked. "They'll know it was you. Let them know." He left without another word. Leah stood alone in the shed, surrounded by oil-soaked rags, tinderboxes, and the small tin of powder, the tools of her deliverance. 2 days later, Maria came to her in the kitchen. "It's ready," she said simply. Leah nodded. "Tomorrow night." Maria's face showed nothing, but her voice was soft. "Your mother would be proud." Leah thought of her mother's name in the ledger, reduced to a line of ink. "My mother would tell me to run. But you won't." "No." That night Leah served dinner as usual. Don Cristobal was in a jovial mood, discussing his plans to expand the cane fields. Doña Isabella smiled and sipped her wine. The guests laughed at his jokes. Leah stood in the corner, silent and invisible, and thought of how quickly fire spreads in dry wood. If you're still watching, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and how this story found you. Chapter 4. The night the wind changed. The last day arrived dressed as all the others. Leah woke before dawn, lit the kitchen fire, prepared the morning meal. The routine was armor, every familiar gesture a disguise for what churned beneath. Don Cristobal left after breakfast to meet with his overseer. Doña Isabella spent the morning in the parlor, embroidering. The house servants moved through their tasks with the usual weary rhythm. No one noticed Leah slip into the pantry and drag a sack of flour to the corner, positioning it near the wall where the shelves held jars of cooking oil. No one saw Maria stuff the oil-soaked rags deeper into the guest wing linen closet. No one watched Samuel check the stable doors, making sure they'd swing open easily if the horses panicked. The wind began to pick up in the afternoon. It came from the east, steady and warm, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant smoke from the field burnings. Perfect. Leah served the evening meal with steady hands. Don Cristobal drank more than usual, 2 bottles of wine between him and his brother, who was visiting from the capital. They talked of politics and money, their voices loud and careless. Doña Isabella excused herself early, complaining of a headache. Leah brought her the laudanum personally, measuring out 3 generous spoonfuls into a glass of sweetened wine. The mistress drank it down without looking at her. "Close the drapes and leave me," Doña Isabella said, her voice already slurring. Leah obeyed. Within 20 minutes she could hear the mistress snoring through the bedroom door. In the dining room, Don Cristobal and his brother were deep in their cups. Leah cleared the plates, refilled the glasses, and waited. By 10 o'clock, both men were stumbling drunk. By 11, Don Cristobal's brother had passed out in his chair. Don Cristobal lurched to his bedroom, nearly knocking over a candelabra on the way. The house settled into its nighttime quiet. Leah moved through the corridors, extinguishing candles in the main rooms, banking fires, performing her usual duties. But in the pantry, she left one small oil lamp burning on the shelf near the flour sack. Its flame danced in the draft. In the guest wing, Maria had already loosened the linen closet door and positioned the oil-soaked rags near the baseboard where the wood was oldest. A single candle burning low sat on the shelf above. In the study, Leah opened the drapes wide, letting the wind through the cracked window push them toward the candelabra on Don Cristobal's desk. She made sure the ledgers were still in the drawer. Let them burn with everything else. At midnight, she met Samuel in the garden. His face was pale in the moonlight. "It's time," she said. He handed her the tinderbox and the small tin of powder. "I put the extra lamp oil in the storage room like you asked, near the grain barrels." "Good, now go. Leah, go. Find Maria, run for the river. Don't look back." Samuel grabbed her hand, squeezed it once, then vanished into the darkness. Leah stood alone in the garden, the wind pulling at her dress. She thought of her mother. She thought of the ledger with all those names. She thought of Salazar's laugh and Doña Isabella's smile and Don Cristobal's indifferent shrug. She thought of fire. She went to the storage room first. The door was unlocked. Samuel had seen to that. Inside, the air smelled of grain and old wood. She poured lamp oil across the floor in a wide arc, splashing it up the walls where the barrels were stacked. Then she struck the flint. The spark caught immediately. Flame raced along the oil trail, climbing the walls, licking at the barrels. Leah stepped back, closed the door, and walked away. The pantry was next. The oil lamp she'd left burning had already tipped. She'd loosened its base earlier. The flame had caught the flour sack, which was smoldering. She poured more oil around the shelves and struck the flint again. The fire bloomed like a flower. In the guest wing, she found the linen closet exactly as Maria had left it. The candle had burned down to a stub. Leah didn't need it. She used the tinderbox, and the oil-soaked rags ignited with a soft whoosh. Finally, she returned to the study. The candelabra on Don Cristobal's desk had already fallen. She'd loosened it when she opened the drapes. The velvet drapes were smoldering. Leah added the last of the lamp oil to the base of the curtains and stepped back. The fire climbed, hungry and fast. Smoke began to fill the corridors. Leah walked through it calmly, her bare feet silent on the tile. She could hear shouts now. Someone in the quarters had seen the smoke. The stable boys were yelling. The horses were screaming. She went to the front door and unlatched it. Then she walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table where she'd eaten her meals for 9 years. The hacienda burned around her. The flames roared, the beams cracked, glass shattered. Leah closed her eyes and listened to the sound of everything falling apart. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The fire ate the hacienda like hunger itself. No mercy, no hesitation, only consumption. The flames found the dry beams and vaulted up to the roof. They devoured the velvet drapes, the oiled furniture, the century-old wood. Smoke poured through the corridors, thick and black. Leah sat in the kitchen, her hands folded on the table. The heat pressed against her skin like fever. She could hear screaming now, the servants waking, the field workers running toward the main house. The chaos of people who'd lived under control suddenly thrust into terror. Someone grabbed her arm. Rosa. "Get up, you fool. The house is burning." Leah looked at her calmly. "I know." Rosa's eyes widened. "You..." She stopped. Understanding flooded her face, followed by something like awe. "Sweet Christ." "Get out," Leah said softly. "Take whoever you can. Blame me. Tell them I went mad." Rosa's grip tightened. "You'll die." "Maybe." For a moment, Rosa just stared at her. Then she nodded once, released her arm and ran. Leah heard her voice in the corridor, shouting for others to flee, to grab what they could and run. Leah stood. The smoke was getting thicker. She could see flames through the doorway, crawling along the ceiling. The pantry was an inferno. The guest wing had collapsed. She could hear the fire spreading toward Don Cristobal's bedroom. She walked through the smoke toward the main corridor. Her eyes stung, her lungs burned, but her mind was clear. She'd planned for this moment. Not escape, but witness. She needed to see it finish. Don Cristobal burst from his bedroom, coughing, his nightshirt stained with soot. He saw her standing in the corridor and his face contorted with fury. "You!" He lurched toward her, his hand raised. "What have you done?" Leah didn't flinch. "What you taught me." He struck her across the face. She staggered but didn't fall. Behind him, the flames were climbing his bedroom door. "You'll hang for this," he screamed. "You'll—" A beam crashed down from the ceiling, landing between them in a shower of sparks. Don Cristobal jumped back, his fury giving way to panic. He looked at the spreading flames, at the collapsing structure, at the smoke filling every space. "The study," he gasped. "The ledgers." "They're gone," Leah said. "Everything's gone." Don Cristobal's face went white. He turned and ran toward the front door, stumbling, coughing. Leah watched him go. She turned and walked the other direction, toward the chapel. It was the oldest part of the hacienda, built of stone and tile. The flames hadn't reached it yet. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The chapel was quiet. Candles still flickered on the altar. The air was cool and still, untouched by the chaos outside. Leah walked to the front pew and sat down. She looked at the crucifix hanging above the altar, the suffering God, the promises of mercy and redemption. "You weren't there," she said aloud, "when I needed you." The crucifix offered no response. Outside, she could hear the roar of the fire, the collapse of walls, the shouts of people running. Inside, there was only silence. The door crashed open. Doña Isabella stumbled in, her nightgown billowing with smoke, her face smeared with ash. She saw Leah sitting calmly in the pew and let out a strangled sound. "You," she whispered. "You did this." Leah stood. "Yes." Doña Isabella's hands shook. "I gave you everything. Clothes, food, a place in my house." "You gave me nothing," Leah said quietly. "You took everything. My mother, my life, my name. You called it mercy and dressed me like a doll and laughed when men hurt me." Doña Isabella's face crumpled. "We saved you. We brought you into our home. You bought me, and you used me. And tonight, the debt came due." The mistress sank to her knees, weeping. "Please, please, I'll let you go. I'll give you money, papers, whatever you want." "I don't want anything from you," Leah said. "I never did." She walked past Doña Isabella and out of the chapel. The fire had reached the main courtyard. The roof of the guest wing had collapsed completely. The study was gone. The servants' quarters were burning. People were running in all directions, some carrying bundles, others empty-handed, all of them fleeing into the night. Leah walked to the edge of the courtyard and stopped. The heat was immense. The hacienda was dying in front of her, its white walls blackened, its proud structure broken. She thought of all the people who'd lived and died here, all the suffering the walls had witnessed, all the silence they'd held. Now there would be no more silence. A hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. An overseer, his face twisted with rage. "You burned it down," he shouted. "You killed them all." Leah met his eyes. "No one's dead. The house is gone. But everyone got out." The overseer raised his fist. Behind him, other men were gathering. Field workers, stable hands, all of them staring at her with a mixture of shock and understanding. Before the overseer could strike, another voice cut through the noise. "She's right." It was Rosa, standing at the edge of the crowd. "No one's dead, just the house." The overseer turned. "She set the fire." "Maybe," Rosa said. "Or maybe God did it. Maybe this place was always going to burn." Chapter 6. What the Ashes Remember. They bound her hands at dawn. The hacienda was rubble and smoke. The main house had collapsed into its foundation, leaving only the stone chapel standing. The guest wing was gone. The study, the pantry, the servants' quarters, all ash. The cane fields had caught fire in the night, and the wind had pushed the flames east for miles before rain finally came and drowned them. Leah sat in the dirt with her hands tied, watching the sun rise over the destruction. The rope cut into her wrists. Her face was bruised from the overseer's blow. But inside, she felt light, emptied out, hollowed by the fire like a forge clearing metal. Don Cristobal stood nearby, shouting orders to salvage what little remained. His brother had fled in the night. Doña Isabella sat in a wagon, her face buried in her hands. The other slaves had been herded into a group and guarded. No one knew yet if they'd been complicit. No one knew what to do with any of them. A horse arrived mid-morning carrying an official from the nearest town, a magistrate, summoned by Don Cristobal's messenger. He was a lean man with gray hair and tired eyes. He dismounted and surveyed the ruins without expression. "How many dead?" he asked. "None," Don Cristobal said through clenched teeth. "They all escaped." The magistrate raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "Every last one. But this girl," he pointed at Leah. "She started it. She confessed." The magistrate walked over to Leah. She didn't look up. "Is this true?" he asked. "Yes." "Why?" Leah met his eyes. "They kept me as a toy. I decided to stop playing." The magistrate's expression didn't change. He turned to Don Cristobal. "Were there ledgers in the house?" Don Cristobal's face went pale. They burned." "I see." The magistrate looked back at the ruins. "This fire destroyed considerable property. There will be questions, investigations, about the losses, the insurance, the management practices." Don Cristobal opened his mouth, then closed it. Leah saw understanding dawn on his face. The ledgers were gone. All the records of his dealings, his bribes, his profitable arrangements. Without them, he had no proof of what he owned, what he'd paid, what he'd lost. The magistrate mounted his horse. "I'll send soldiers to take the girl. She'll stand trial. As for the rest," he looked at Don Cristobal, "I suggest you focus on rebuilding, and perhaps reviewing your household management." He rode away. By afternoon, soldiers arrived. They put Leah in chains and loaded her into a wagon. As they prepared to leave, she saw Maria in the crowd. Maria, who'd run as instructed, then returned with the others when dawn came. Their eyes met. Maria nodded once. Samuel was there too, his face young and afraid. Leah smiled at him. "You're free now," she wanted to say. "Run far and live well." The wagon pulled away. Leah looked back once and saw the ruins of the hacienda shrinking in the distance, the blackened walls, the collapsed roof, the chapel standing alone like a gravestone. She never saw it again. The trial lasted 3 days. They charged her with arson and destruction of property. Don Cristobal testified that she'd acted alone, that she'd been mad with jealousy, that the other slaves knew nothing. He couldn't risk questions about the ledgers, about the things they'd documented, about how many laws he'd broken. So he gave them Leah as the only villain, and that was enough. They sentenced her to hang. On the morning of her execution, they walked her to the gallows in the town square. A crowd gathered, some curious, some angry, some silent and watching. Leah climbed the steps calmly. The rope was rough against her neck. The priest offered last rites. She refused them. The magistrate read the sentence aloud. Then he asked if she had any final words. Leah looked out at the crowd. She saw Rosa standing at the back, her face wet with tears. She saw Samuel beside her, his fists clenched. She saw others too. Faces from the hacienda, people who'd lived under Don Cristobal's cruelty and survived. "I'm not sorry," Leah said clearly. "And I'm not alone." The magistrate nodded to the executioner. The trap door opened. They buried her in unmarked ground behind the church. No stone, no name, no prayer. Don Cristobal rebuilt his hacienda on the same foundation, grander than before. He lived 20 more years and died wealthy, but the story didn't end there. The slaves who'd escaped in the fire scattered to other plantations, other towns, other lives. They carried the story with them. They told it in kitchens and quarters, in fields and markets. They changed her name, embellished the details, but the core remained. A girl who'd been kept as a toy until she became a torch. Some said the fire had been an accident. Others said it was divine judgment. But the ones who'd been there, who'd seen her sitting calmly in the burning kitchen, who'd watched her walk through smoke without fear, they knew the truth. She'd burned the hacienda because some structures can only be destroyed, not reformed. because endurance has limits, because silence, when broken, becomes a roar. The land where the hacienda stood is farmland now. Sometimes when the wind comes from the east and carries the smell of smoke, people say they can hear bells ringing. They say it's the chapel, still standing on that hill, tolling for a girl whose name they've forgotten but whose fire they remember. History records her as a criminal, but the people who lived under the weight she lifted, they remember her differently. They remember the night the hacienda burned, and how the flames lit the sky like justice, brief and terrible and bright. If this story kept you holding your breath, hit like. It helps us bring more forgotten histories back to life. She endured until endurance broke, then chose the fire over the silence. The cost was her life. The payment was truth. Subscribe for more true-to-life tales of defiance, endurance, and the quiet justice history tried to bury.